We're excited to have Jamie Morgenstern from University of Washington talking about learning from multiple data sources.
All right, great. Thanks so much. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about some recent work, and I'll be focusing on work that's joint with Chris Young, who's just about to start as a postdoc at Stanford. He did his PhD at Penn, and that was where he was when he was working with me. And he's amazing, so always if you have an opportunity, say hi, work with him. He's great. As well as Pranjal Awasthi, who's also great, but is not quite so junior. A research scientist at Google. I'm mostly going to spend today sort of motivating what I thought was a perhaps obvious problem that many of you may have encountered, and see, I'll give you a little bit of ideas about some of the technical ingredients we use to approach this problem, but there are really a lot more open questions than like specific answers that we have to address. Okay. So you all are at this workshop, so I imagine that you have all interacted with problems of the following type. We posit the existence of some distribution, which generates for us some training data in some nice IID way, right? Combinations of XY pairs, draw an IID from this nice green distribution, which we then throw at some machine learning algorithm, which we design or maybe just use off the shelf, which then produces for us a model, right? And the hope is that once we have this model, we can take some unlabeled data, which is still drawn IID from the same distribution, maybe without labels, and use that model to make predictions of labels for that data drawn IID from this new distribution. And the hope is that this is going to work well, right? And under lots of conditions, we all sort of understand that this can work well, right? Under various conditions about the machine learning algorithm, about the model it produces, if the distribution is particularly nice, and so forth, right? But sort of fundamental to most of the work that works in this sort of batch setting, right, where we have a bunch of data drawn from the same distribution, fundamental to knowing how and when this works is an understanding that our data S prime, right, our test data, is actually drawn from the same distribution, or the same marginal distribution over X's as was our training data, right? Okay. So I want to spend a few minutes thinking about whether or not it's reasonable to assume that training data and test data are identically distributed. Okay? And I want to start by saying the fact that we gather training data, have to do a bunch of processing upon it, have to hire a bunch of people to do various labeling operations and cleanup and various things, means that there's generally a fair bit of time between the time at which we gather training data and the time at which we deploy our model on some new data, right? And for that reason alone, right, there's generally a fair bit of time that passes between when our training data was gathered and processed and when our test data is actually being run through our models. And that time by itself often leads to drift, right? Meaning we're no longer looking at data drawn from the same distribution, right? And I can mean that in many different ways. For example, it might be that the distribution over features looks different in training and test. It might also be that the relationship between features and labels changes between training and test. And, worse than that, right, just not simply that like something exogenous to the world we're thinking about might change the set of distributions we're interacting with, but it might also be the case that like some of the learning we have done has actually affected the distribution we see for any number of different reasons, right? For example, maybe we have chosen to intentionally sample our training data in a way which is not IID from the distribution, right? There are all sorts of reasons to do this, right? For example, right, we're Kevin Javison's best friend, and we've decided to do some active learning, right? But we're like not his really good friend, so we've done some active learning, but we haven't actually like carefully thought about how we're using that data, right? So we have a bunch of samples that are not IID from like the natural distribution, and like maybe we do something stupid with them, and so like then if we're actually at test time, the data we're seeing is almost certainly not going to be matching that same distribution, right? It might also be the case that we're doing some kind of allocation or making some decisions or predictions that the people who are interacting with our system actually care quite a bit about. Right? So for example, I might be, I don't know, Chase Bank or something, and I'm trying to decide which customers I want to give like special introductory APR loans on some new credit card, right? And if some subset of you in this room are interested in getting that lower APR, right, you might be willing to change your behavior online to be offered the available, you know, some kind of discount on some kind of product like a credit card. And so the fact that I am trying to predict who should I give this this kind of coupon to has induced you to change sort of how you represent yourself as data on this platform. So the actual learning that I have done based on some behavior of people on this platform might actually change the distribution of customers or possible people who might be recipients of this advertisement might see. Right? Okay, so, you know, maybe the primary statement that I want to make for this talk is that, you know, it's relatively unreasonable to assume that like most problems have training and test data which is identically distributed for any number of different reasons, these and others, right? And I want to maybe even make a stronger statement, which is that training and test data are virtually never distributed equally. Instead of thinking about our training data being generated from the same distribution as our test data is generated, you know, what does reality often look like, right? If you're thinking about being a practitioner who's not just like training a single model one time on some data set and then like throwing it into the world assuming that like the world is never going to change, right? Instead, we might have like a small version of that, and it might be the case that then we gather some more data at some other time, and we want to combine the data from these two different points at which we gather data, and maybe do this a bunch of times, right? And here, if we assume that our training data was drawn from several different distributions, right, then it's definitely not going to be the case that our test distribution is going to be identically distributed to the place where all of our training data came from. Right? And I'd imagine a lot of you, you know, if you were Ludwig or anybody else, right, has thought about like, okay, so I actually have multiple different data sets that are all labeled for the same task, but came from fairly different places or were captured at various points in time, and they're probably related, but they're not sort of, they weren't generated via the identical procedure, right? And how can we reason about how to do machine learning in worlds where we have data that come from multiple different sources? Right? And there are, you know, some approaches to this, but I'm going to motivate like one particular way to think about this problem. Okay, so what should we do if we have like a collection of data sets, which we all believe are somewhat related to each other, but not generated in sort of the identical way? How should we use those to do something reasonable in terms of machine learning problems we might care about? And as I've sort of alluded, right, our standard theory doesn't generally say a whole lot about this, right? You could use, you know, you could go sort of to the like far-flung edges of like what's possible, and you could say, well, I could treat all of this data as sort of coming online, and you know, maybe there's some approach that like doesn't make any distributional assumptions or very limited distributional assumptions. That's one thing I could do, but I am sort of making. I've been trying to motivate for you a collection of settings which are nicer than fully online or adversarial setups, right? But are less nice than the standard IID assumptions that we generally make for, you know, an introductory grad machine learning class or something. Okay? So at least some of our training data is not going to follow the test distribution. What can we do? We should start by asking, you know, what are we assuming might differ between our distributions, right? And the short answer for the purposes of this talk is like, I want to imagine all sorts of different things might change, right? I want to assume that it's possible that some change has taken place over the features we observe, right? So if I collect it, is that a question? Okay. Maybe I've collected, ImageNet version 1, and, I wait some number of years, and then I collect ImageNet version 2. Like, probably a bunch of things could change, right? Including but not limited to, like, the set of things people take pictures of, and as well as, like, the resolution of their cameras and these sorts of things. It turns out that I think Ludwig has done a very careful job making sure sort of as many of these things don't change as possible. But in a lot of cases, if you're not being careful, right, and you gather two different data sets, it's almost certain that you'll see some change in the shift over features you observe over time, right? I also want to permit the possibility that the relationship between the set of features we observe and the thing we're trying to predict might change over time, right? And there are a bunch of reasons to allow some of this kind of drift. It is something that can be seen in practice. Obviously, if there's too much of this kind of drift, some of these data sets will not be relevant or will not be particularly useful for making future predictions. But to some extent, some limited amount of the change between the relationship between X and Y may still be possible. Okay? I also, and this is sort of the fundamental thing that I'll talk about for most of the rest of this talk, want to think about the possibility that some of my data sets might have additional features that the other ones did not have, right? And I'll motivate that more precisely in a minute. But I want to think about, maybe I have two data sets, one of which has like, maybe they overlap in a bunch of different features, but like one of them has extra features, right? Like between 2000 and 2010, everyone has gotten like a much fancier camera phone in their pocket. And so like my image data sets suddenly have like much higher resolution. Okay. So I want to talk about a couple of applications that I've been thinking about when working on this particular project. Okay, so suppose we have some kind of emergent health phenomenon. I don't know. There are any number of different things you might think about. But we might have a bunch of different hospitals that are geographically distributed throughout North America. And they're all gathering data that we might like to use to learn something about like which individuals are most susceptible to this new emergent health phenomenon, right? And they might be located in really different places, right? That might be Juneau. We might have one in Juneau. We might have one in, I don't know what part of Canada that is. I should, but don't know. Maybe we have one in like Phoenix, one in sort of like the Midwest, one in the sort of Northeast. And maybe they're all gathering data about the patients that they're seeing. And we'd like to understand, can we learn more about this emergent health phenomenon, taking into account that all of these different hospitals are gathering data about the patients that they're seeing, and recognizing that the populations of people that they're serving are all quite different. Right? They all, many of the populations they see, some of the places are quite rural, some of them are quite urban. There will be people who are working and living in much tighter living conditions in some places than others. There will be places where multi-generational families are more or less common, living in a single household, as well as there being sort of different rates of whatever emergent health phenomenon might be sort of latent in the various different locations, right? It might also be the case that some of these hospitals have access to testing for this particular emergent health phenomenon and others do not, right? Maybe the hospitals that are places with major research institutions with virology departments or other things have access to PCA machines or PCR machines, they might be able to do a lot more testing of their patients than some of the other hospitals might have, right? But the question is, like, if I have all of these different data sets, which might vary in all sorts of different ways, is there some meaningful way that I can use all of this data to do a better job understanding which individual patients might be susceptible to or experiencing this new health phenomenon, right? Okay. So are there any questions about that before I go forward? Okay. So the point here is that like some of these hospitals may or may not have labels for this new emergent health phenomenon, and they almost certainly have like different populations, right? That should feel like distribution, like that should feel like covariate shift. There are all sorts of different shifts that might be true between these different hospitals. Yeah?
When you mentioned previously that the probability of Y given X may have changed, do you also allow for the possibility that the set Y itself has changed, so additional labels?
So that isn't something we've considered here, although one thing we are going to address in like the specific thing that I'll talk about in a minute is we're allowing for the possibility that some hospitals are generating labeled data and others unlabeled data, right? So it might, for example, be the case, as I said, right, that like the hospitals in large cities or hospitals near large research institutions have access to tests, so they are actually testing all their patients, and then other hospitals don't have access to tests, for example. So, yeah.
I'm trying to understand the figure on the left. Does this mean, like, in this example, each hospital will train its own model and get data from other hospitals, then train its own model?
So I wouldn't read too much into the stuff on the left. That was a bit of an artifact of like the previous thing. But the point being, like, you could, in theory, right, like train a bunch of different models for each of these different hospitals, or at least the ones that are providing you labels, and then you could think about sort of how you might want to ensemble those or something. But you know, it's more just trying to express that like there are different distributions of patients that the different hospitals are treating. Okay, great. Okay, so I want to give you sort of one other use case to keep in mind as something that sort of motivated the particular formalization that we looked at. Okay, so suppose I'm some large tech company and I have built some kind of model for predicting something. And I've spent, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, gathering some fancy data set and labeling it and doing all of this cleanup work, and then like burn down half the Amazon to actually train this model. And then, you know, only after I deploy it do I recognize that this model works very poorly for people who are not walking on two legs and people who are not above 5 feet tall, right? Happens somewhat regularly, unfortunately, right? That like some company spends a lot of time and energy building a model and then like deploys it, and then after the fact somebody says, hey, like, you know, your model doesn't work on this collection of people. And, you know, there are any, right? So this can definitely happen and happen somewhat regularly, right? So when this happens, there's an interesting question about what to be done, right? And it's probably the case that you know, there are any number of reasons why a model might have this property. But, you know, sort of the best formal thing to do, right, as a scientist, would probably be to throw everything away and start over, right? Rethink like the set of the way you're going to gather data, the set of features you're going to observe, like think carefully and rigorously as you design the model and your data generating process and all of these different things about the different populations you really want to guarantee some kind of accuracy upon, and do things from there, right? And that's probably the best thing to do for a bunch of different reasons, but it's often not the most cost-effective thing to do. Right? You might instead think about, you know, things you could do that would take advantage of the huge amount of time and effort and energy that was used in developing this model and this particular data set, right? And so you might think about doing one of the following things, right? You might think about figuring out ways to augment your existing data set. And maybe doing some kind of fine-tuning as a result, right? For example, maybe you hypothesize the reason your model works much worse on people who are not walking on two legs or people who are shorter might be the case that there just weren't enough of those in your data set, right? So you might go around and like intentionally try to sample with higher probability people that belong to those populations, right? And then like either, you know, do some fine-tuning or add those to your data set and like do something new. You might gather additional data and explicitly label, or go back through your existing data set and explicitly label, hey, these are people who are under 5 feet tall, these are people who are on bicycles or in various like assistive technologies that mean that they're not walking on two legs. We should actually track the loss on these different populations, right? And you know, you could definitely think about sort of different ways that you might augment that data set to try to ameliorate this, right? And you know, you may or may not be doing that in a way that's sort of just gathering a whole bunch more IID data and throwing away everything you already had, right? And believe me when I say that there are, you know, lots of people who want to like think about less expensive and still like fairly rigorous ways of thinking about, okay, I have a data set. This data set has some problems, but it's also huge and has a lot of statistical power. How can we do something besides just like going back to the drawing board and starting completely from scratch when thinking about how to develop a new data set and a corresponding model that has sort of more equitable distribution of losses across our populations. Okay? Okay, so this is sort of the primary example that we had in our mind when we formalized the thing I'll tell you about in a minute. But does the point here, you know, our initial training set probably didn't have information about which people were below 5 feet tall, and probably didn't have information about, maybe it had information about who was on a bicycle or who was in a wheelchair or something like that. But like, you know, if it was just images with like bounding boxes around, this is a person, this is not a person, right? We might not have these additional pieces of information, like even if we wanted to go back and use our initial training set. And even if we had enough information, you know, we had statistically enough information to be able to do it, we might not be able to track the loss on the populations that we observed was worse, just because we didn't bother gathering that those additional features when we were creating that data set. Okay? Okay, so if you remember nothing else from this talk, the point that I want you to think about is that like reasoning about training on multiple data sources is super important. And there are sort of good ways to start to approach this problem. And it's especially important if one cares about sort of the equitable distribution of loss over multiple populations of people, right? And it's almost certainly the case that no matter how careful of a job you do when gathering a data set and training a model, you will find some populations on which you are not going to perform as well. And that will always be true, right? And so, you know, it's worth thinking about sort of how much you can augment as opposed to like sort of completely start from scratch the set of data that you have to train upon. Okay, so the things I'm going to talk about are definitely related to a bunch of stuff that many of you, if not most of you, have heard some subset of, right? This is the work I'm going to talk about is definitely related to something called distributionally robust optimization. If you know what that is, great. If you don't, that's fine. I'll tell you a bit more about it in a moment. It's also quite related to some of the things that are known as, you know, semi-supervised learning, transfer learning, or domain adaptation. And you know, I won't say as much about those, but you'll understand if you know something about those why there's some relationship there in a minute. And this is also somewhat related to some recent lines of work that have been thinking about when robust optimization actually has something to say or something to contribute to guaranteeing some kind of notions of fairness. But I won't say too much more about that. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the exact model that we formalize and the problem that we begin to say something about. Okay? Okay. So the formal model, now that I've given you all of these different examples, I'm going to give you like a much more basic, simplified model that we can say something about. Okay? So let's imagine that we have one distribution, dp, which produces examples that have features x, labels y, and we have some radius rp, which you can think of in your favorite like distance measure over distributions, right? And this is going to be one of the things that generates samples for us, right? And then imagine we also have another data set generating distribution, right? Which also provides for us features x, some extra features a, and some new radius, right? And the question, you know, in this like simplified model is, when would you expect that training on data from both dp and da simultaneously, when would you expect that to allow you to do something more interesting than just training on data from dp by itself, right? DA doesn't have any of the information about y, so you wouldn't expect to be able to do anything non-trivial just looking at features from examples from DA. But if you have both of these distributions that are generating data for you simultaneously, when would you expect that to be helpful? One thing you'll probably need in order for the second unlabeled distribution to be useful is for the distribution that are generating these different samples to be sufficiently close together, right? And again, I mean that in your favorite distance measure. We use Wasserstein distance in this particular work, but it's not it's not fundamental to the general problem paradigm we're thinking about, right? So if it's the case that there are actually a bunch of distributions which are close to these two different distributions, that's going to be a world in which you might imagine that this unlabeled data with auxiliary features might be useful for you, right? So the question we ask is whether, given data from DP and also from DA that have overlapping radiuses like this, is it possible to build a model that maps from the features we have in both data sets along with this additional set of features A that only come from one of our data sets to predict Y? And is it possible to build a model that does that, that performs well for any distribution which is not too far from both of those distributions? Oops, sorry. Right? So I'll draw a picture in a second, but the idea here is going to be we assume that these distributions, or we make decisions about how large the radiuses are between these distributions so that there exist distributions which are close to both. And we're going to want to build a model that sort of does well predicting Y on X and A together. That's good for as many of those distributions as possible. Okay? Okay, so the one slide introduction to distributionally robust optimization, if you haven't heard of this before, it should feel familiar if you've heard of this before. Distributionally robust optimization asks for like a special case of this, right? Generally speaking, right, distributionally robust optimization says, I'm getting training data from some distribution, right? And I would like to be able to pick a model which works well for predicting Y for any data set or for any distribution which is not too far from that distribution, right? So rather than optimizing for loss on the same distribution, I'm going to hedge my loss and try to get as, do a sort of min-max optimization, find the model that does as well as possible over the entire collection of distributions, which is not too far from my training data. Okay? Okay. So the thing we're thinking about here is a generalization of distributionally robust optimization, where we're imagining we might be getting training data from multiple sources. Okay? Cool. Okay, so I'm going to give you like the one slide description of the main result that we have and tell you a little bit about some of the experiments we have and spend the rest of the time giving you some open questions to think about. Okay, so the main result that we have here is, if we think about these two different data generating distributions, we design an algorithm that does find linear models that uses both the features from both data sets and this augmenting additional feature information to predict the label Y that we have on the first data set. And we do it in such a way that we can guarantee that it performs sort of as well as possible on every distribution that is not too far away from both of those training distributions. Before I say anything else, is that clear? Any questions? Yeah.
G and D are both we have different outcomes.
Yeah. So pretend both distributions live in a space over X times A times Y. Right? If they are in the same space, if they have the same type, we can talk about distances in distribution space over X cross A cross Y. That's what I mean. Okay? Yeah. Good question. Other questions? Okay. So all I'm saying here is we will look at two distributions which are not too far apart, and we will be able to find a model which hedges against and sort of does as well as possible on all the distributions which are close to both of those distributions. Okay. This particular result, right, is just for linear models, thinking about log loss, and there's some additive error that we don't know if it's strictly necessary for the purposes of getting like a computationally tractable algorithm, but like the thing that we know how to do with like sort of computational efficiency gets some additive error on top of sort of the optimal loss over that uncertainty set in orange that's drawn there. Okay. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about that? I'm happy to talk more about the details of that offline. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's more of a philosophical question.
Yeah.
Number one, how do you choose RPRA, the ball sizes?
Mm-hmm.
And then even the distance, DDP and all that. So, yeah, so high level.
Yeah. A high level question. So for one, for this to even be a feasible problem, right? You want it to be the case that like that orange set is non-empty, right? And so if you look at the two different training sets you have, right, you can do a reasonable job approximating the distance between those different data sets in just X space, right? That's the only part of the space in which you can definitely do like some reasonable estimate without making some assumptions, right? So like if one of my training sets is only images of cats and the other one is only of dogs, we're going to be in trouble right there, right? Like you sort of know that those are far apart, independent of how the feature sets are related to Y or whatever additional information you have, right? But if you sort of assume that there's some more relationship there, right, you could do some kind of estimation, some empirical estimation of the distance between your two data sets in just feature space, just in X space, right? And the remainder of like the sort of things you'll be able to say will depend upon how much you assume Y might change or A might change between the different distributions, right? So just like in standard distributionally robust optimization, there's going to be a trade-off that you're going to make, which is...
Yeah, my question is also about the standard distribution.
Yeah, so standard DRO, right? You're basically making a trade-off. Like the bigger the radius you consider, the more robust your thing is, but the crappier it's going to be. No offense to anyone who loves distributionally robust optimization, right? You'll be like optimizing for worst case loss over a larger and larger set of distributions. And at some point that means you're going to have a model that works very poorly on most distributions, right? So, right, because if you just like allow your radius to go to like, I don't know, go to infinity, right? Then you're capturing all distributions. Yeah.
I guess my high level question is more at this point, is it just an ad hoc?
Yeah. I think the short answer is yes. There are some like rules of thumb you can use, right? Like especially in this case, right, where you actually have data from two different distributions, you can do some approximation for like some notions of distance between them. And then basically there's a choice you're making, right? And as you increase the two radiuses, you're going to be like guaranteeing that you're robust against more and more shift at the expense of sort of doing better and better at the actual distributions you might be facing. Yeah.
And the notions of distance chosen here, are they also just ad hoc, or is it just whatever notion of distance we can optimize? Or?
Yeah, so the particular thing I'm talking about here is all in terms of Wasserstein distance over this X cross A cross Y space. It is sensical to say these sorts of things for other distance measures, but there are lots of reasons for like, mathematical convenience or computational convenience to use some rather than others. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Other questions, thoughts? Okay. So I want to note here, right, that this result is allowing us to build a model not just on the features that we had from our labeled data set, but also use this sort of additional auxiliary feature information that we got from the second data set, right? So like when I built some fancy data set in 2000 and did a really good job labeling all of that data, and then I like fast forwarded to 2022 and everybody has like much higher resolution cameras, right? If I want to do prediction tasks on new high resolution images, right, it'd be nice to actually be able to use that additional information, and this does give us some way to do that, right? So, there's actually some gain that could be above and beyond the fact that you have additional training data. You're getting the ability to learn some relationship between X and A and Y, right? Under the assumption that like the distributions don't change too much. Okay, So I'm going to tell you just a couple of things about sort of how this algorithm works, and then show you some experiments. Okay. So if you are familiar, yeah.
Is there a specific reason we are considering the intersection of these two balls? Or can we like say there's a different ball that's centered between the distributions, but the radius is small enough, large enough to contain both the distributions, that could be like another set.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not particularly married to this exact notion. There are a couple reasons why it's nice, but it's not like philosophically crucial, right? I think one thing that is important is like you would only expect these data sets to help you do better at prediction if they're both not too far from whatever distribution you're facing at test time, right? So like if you thought about like, right, you could certainly think about like a ball that's centered somewhere in this uncertainty set or something, and that would probably also be fine. Like it would probably also be the case that this auxiliary data set would help you. One world in which you wouldn't necessarily expect to get any benefit from this second data set, or at least it's not clear to me that you could, is if like you took like a ball that captured both balls, right? If you thought about like the union and then maybe even some more stuff around both of your training distributions, you now have a huge uncertainty set, right? And it's not clear, like it's not even clear. You could hedge against more distributions, but it's not even clear that like when your ball was pretty small that second data set would help you very much in such a regime, right? Yeah, so this is sort of like a philosophical, like it's a mathematical convenience, but it's also like philosophically I would only expect like 2 data sets to help me with some learning task if like the thing I'm actually going to be like facing at test time is kind of close to both of those distributions. Otherwise, like probably should just throw out the one that's further away. Okay. Other questions? These are great. This is more fun than me walking through slides, so other people should ask questions. Okay. So the way this algorithm works is like, you know, fairly simple in the sense that I can give you a description in like 3 lines on this slide. But it'll make a little more sense if you're familiar with sort of how distributionally robust optimization works. So if you are, great. If you aren't, like I'm giving you like a 3-line description of sort of how DRO algorithms kind of work. Okay, so the way this generally works is you're looking for a coupling between your distribution dp, your distribution dA, and some unknown d prime, or at least it'd be a coupling if it was just dp and d prime. That's normally what these are called, right? I'm trying to think about a way to move between these distributions in distribution space. I guess tripling is probably the right word since we have 3 things rather than 2 things that we're trying to map between. And then we formulate some appropriate dual program and solve the dual using some kind of projected gradient descent, right? So in general, right, if I knew which d prime I was facing, right, the thing I want to do is figure out how to use information from dp to help me learn about something about d prime, and similarly the information from dA to learn something about d prime. And how do I share that information? Well, I basically want to match up training data from dp and training data from dA. So I understand, so I can learn some relationship between x's and a's and y's, right? And that's informally what's happening here, right? And then we also sort of want to understand like how we can use that to like actually make a prediction for this unknown distribution. So, you know, this takes like 10 or 15 pages of math, but like this is the general idea behind sort of how this algorithm works, right? You just need to figure out a way to say, okay, when I see when I see one of my labeled examples from DP and I see an unlabeled data point with auxiliary information, like how close are these, right? Should I expect that like these X's are pretty close, and therefore I assume like my auxiliary information and my label is also going to be pretty close, right? If that's the case, then like I can sort of transfer information across these distributions. Okay, so I want to say one thing about equitable prediction. So as I mentioned, like one of the things that was motivating for this was thinking about the following, right? I might have some data set which has, I I guess it's like afternoon fly to the East Coast time. I don't know, like a lot of loud jets. Okay, so I might have some large data set with features X along with labels Y, and I might have realized ex post that my model works very poorly on some population, and I didn't gather that demographic information on my initial data set, right? But one thing I could do is I could go gather a new data set and gather, while I'm gathering that data set, get demographic information for the individuals that belong to that data set, right? And I may or may not actually do the job of labeling those examples with the target task Y I'm thinking about, but I might have now a really rich collection of data about X comma demographic information, and my initial previous data set X comma the thing I'm trying to predict. And an interesting question is, can I use those things together to train a model that tries to trade off between my global loss and some kind of penalization for how different my loss might be on different populations, that the demographic information of which I gathered only in the second data set. Okay. So if we suppose A contains demographic information, we show that this is also a possible optimization you can solve, right? So we can compute a model which minimizes some kind of global loss, think about it as log loss, minus some kind of penalty for how different the loss is on the different populations, which are defined by the demographic information we captured on the second data set, right? So the auxiliary information I'm capturing, I can use both to do a better job predicting in the first case, right, where I have higher resolution cameras. I can actually utilize that higher resolution information when doing prediction. I can also use it to impose some kind of constraints or penalties on the optimization I'm doing if I care about, for example, differences in accuracy between different populations. Okay. So I want to tell you just a tiny bit about some experiments we have. There are still a lot more open questions than precise things that we can say here. But the high level story here is that we took some data sets from UCI and we split them into two, right? And then, or split them into at least two. But we split the training sets into two, and then erased some features and some labels from the various analogous parts, and then just ran our algorithm on this, right? And we saw that this worked surprisingly well. And this was even in a regime where we didn't assume there was any shift between the different distributions, right? So we're probably solving a harder problem than we needed to solve, okay? So that's the high-level description of what I'm about to show you. Here are some details. These are the particular data sets we looked at. And we just uniformly at random split our training data into two pieces. On one piece, we erased the labels. On the other piece, we erased some of the features. Yes, that's right. That's the right direction. And then we basically said, okay, in this much simpler problem, do we see something reasonable? And we compared our method, which we call data join, with a bunch of things that are sort of natural things you might want to compare to see if there's actually any benefit to sort of doing this approach as opposed to just ignoring the unlabeled data set. Right? So we compared to just logistic regression on the labeled data set we have, similarly regularized logistic regression on that same labeled data set. Then we looked at a couple things that are a little more complicated, so I want to tell you a little bit about them. So one of the ways, those are two natural benchmarks that only look at the labeled data, and we do better than those in basically every case. But that's not a totally fair comparison. We have more information than they have, right? We also have this additional unlabeled data that has additional features. But unless you do something careful, it's not obvious what those approaches would even do with that additional data. So we also we had some points that we included in both data sets, right? We split these. I said we split them in a disjoint way. We actually kept some common data points in both. And then you can think about sort of how well the same logistic regression and regularized logistic regression work if they only look at overlapped data points. Okay? And then we finally compared like what we do to like training on the entire union of these data sets when you had A and Y, right? You had all features, all auxiliary features and labels for all of them. Okay, so that is sort of like an unfair comparison for us as opposed to for the other data sets or for the other experimental benchmarks. Okay, and the high level story here is that like the full, you know, if you give an algorithm like all of the information, right, that's going to be best. That's unsurprising, right? If you have X and A and Y on all of your training data and there's no shift, training on all of that data is best. But then somewhat more surprisingly, our method was as good or better as anything else that we talked about, which is sort of surprising because we're solving a harder problem than we necessarily need to solve, right? Because this is not a case in which we see drift between the distributions that are generating these different data sets. We're just like erasing various pieces, right? Some fraction of our training data doesn't have labels, some of it doesn't have some of our features, and we're training, you know, we're sort of optimizing over an uncertainty set which is bigger than these other methods are. So this is just a beginning of a story. It's definitely not sort of the conclusion by any means, right? But it does seem like these approaches can give you some robustness and some additional methods for thinking about how to like use additional features you might have on some other data set to do a better job making predictions in the future. Okay? Okay. We also have some preliminary experimental results that show that even in the case of covariate shift, like our method does much better. But that was, you know, that was something that we did largely in the context of some synthetic data set as opposed to in like a real world setting. Okay. So a couple of open questions and then I'll wrap up. It's worth thinking about whether we had some like weird additive loss term. So if you're like, you know, if you're a grad student who's looking for like a technical open problem, like this is probably a nice one. I think it's also just generally interesting to think about whether there's some like theory behind the following question, right? Which I call multi-anchor distributionally robust optimization. And somewhat surprisingly, I hadn't heard anyone talk about this as like a problem to think about before. Right? So like DRO is something that like there's a whole literature on at this point. But the possibility that I have multiple distributions generating data, even in the same space, right? I just have XY pairs drawn from several different distributions, right? Is it actually, you know, reasonably computationally feasible to optimize over the set of distributions which are close to all of those at once, right? This is not something I've seen introduced anywhere else, but it seems really useful and relevant in a bunch of different cases. And somehow, like, it's always fun when you find like a mathematical problem that you assume should have been like explored in the 50s, but you haven't found any literature that has done that yet. Okay, so yeah, so multi-anchor DRO is like a cool thing that people should spend some time thinking about. Okay, so I do want to say one more thing, and then I'll be done. Okay, so this method minimizes the difference in like some kind of loss, you know, log loss minus some like penalty between these different demographic groups. But we shouldn't think of that as like an excuse to doing a good job actually building careful data sets and doing like a good job actually sampling appropriately from different populations, right? This isn't to say that this is like the way you should solve any demographic disparity you have for any model you have. It's just like there are cases in which this can already buy you something considerable compared to the baseline. Okay? All right, that's all I wanted to say, and happy to take more questions. Yeah, Mariam.
Yeah, so in the multi-anchor problem, if you go back to that slide, is it basically looking for a D prime that's in the intersection of three balls? So
Yeah.
you are maximizing over three ball intersection. I see.
Right? Like standard DRO is just one ball, but like I think it makes sense to think about the intersection of multiple balls.
I see. And maybe another version can look at like a ball that covers the intersection of three balls.
Right. Yeah. As was asked a bit earlier. Like,
oh, okay.
No. Not to say. Yes, that's another interesting question, and it's right. Like, it's not obvious to me that that would make, I mean, the intersection's already convex if we're caring about like computational feasibility or whatever. It's not obvious to me that a ball will be much nicer than the intersection of these things. Yeah, but like some of the computational cost comes from like coupling between many different distributions, right? So it's not obvious to me if like the problem is the space, the shape of the uncertainty set. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you for a great talk. Is there, by any chance, any connection between this, maybe a tenuous connection, and multitask learning kind of explored like back in 2010, like Ander and Zhang looking at multiple tasks and they're coupled and subspace selection, so there is a penalty to deviate for each model too much, and there are linear models and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I would definitely, I think there probably is some, right? And this is related to like, okay, so semi-supervised learning, some of your data's labeled, some of it's not. Multitask, I think definitely emphasizes this idea that the relationship between X and Y might change. Maybe also other things will change. I think our approach does sort of assume you do have a pretty related task of predicting Y. Like if the Y's change too much, this is not going to be a particularly good approach, right, between your different distributions. Whereas I generally think of like, right, multitask learning as like there really being like maybe some pretty different relationship between X and Y. Not just that it might change a little, but that it might really be a fundamentally different task. But I'm not an expert in multitask learning by any means, so I'd love to hear more if you want to chat.
Does your method also handle the case where, say, some attributes are missing randomly? Like, so you have missing entries in the... So in this case, what I understood was you have one data set with X, one data set with X, comma A. But now you have X, comma Y with X is, yeah.
So that's a good question. I think in short, no, but
Because it's not consistent anymore, the things that are missing.
That's right. Yeah, no, in short, our method doesn't handle that. But that's another collection of interesting things that, like, you know, probably required new techniques, right? And an interesting question is sort of like, how many of the features that might be missing, either in training or test, do you want to use to actually make future predictions?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting, relevant talk. I guess the choice of the radius could be important here to find a common intersection point. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, in practice, how are these radiuses set here?
Yeah, so we for the empirical things we did a couple things. One of which is like we definitely didn't consider radiuses that made this like an infeasible optimization, right? So we like computed some estimate of the distance between the x's, like the distribution over x's we had for the different data sets. You can also do some, and I think we looked at some like constant multiples of those. Like we didn't do something particularly clever. You can also think about like if you did have some understanding about like what your test distribution was, you could think about using that as like some kind of validation set to pick some better radiuses. I think we explored that a little bit as well.